The object had been detected 3 weeks before it entered the solar system, a gravitational anomaly that sent ripples through the deep space network's monitoring stations. At first, the scientists at SETI and NASA believed it was a comet, perhaps a rogue asteroid with an unusual trajectory. But as it drew closer, the readings became impossible to ignore. The object was too large, too dense, and it was decelerating with a precision that defied natural explanation. It was a vessel, and it was coming directly toward Earth. The discovery sent shockwaves through every government on the planet. Emergency sessions were called, secret briefings were held, and for the first time in human history, the leaders of every major nation sat together in a room, staring at the same data, feeling the same cold dread creeping into their bones. The vessel was enormous, dwarfing anything humanity had ever constructed. It was nearly 800 kilometers in diameter, a disk of dark, non-reflective material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It had no visible engines, no windows, no markings of any kind. It was simply there, a silent monolith against the backdrop of the stars. Satellites were repositioned to observe it, telescopes were aimed at it, and radio telescopes were tuned to every frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum, listening for any signal, any hint of what this thing was or what it wanted. There was nothing but silence. The vessel remained on its trajectory, adjusting its course with infinitesimal precision, heading directly for a stable orbit around Earth. The leaders of humanity had no response, because there was nothing to respond to. There was no communication, no demand, no threat, and no explanation. The media went into a frenzy. Every news channel, every social media platform, every corner of the internet was consumed by the image of the alien vessel, a vast and dark disk that now hung in the sky, visible even in daylight as a blot against the blue. Conspiracy theories flourished alongside scientific speculation, and fear gripped the world. Some believed it was the end of days, others believed it was the beginning of a new age, and still others believed it was simply the first contact humanity had always dreamed of. But nobody knew for certain, and the uncertainty was worse than any answer could have been. In the United Nations, the Security Council convened in an emergency session that lasted for days. The representatives of every nation spoke in turn, their words filled with fear and confusion, their eyes constantly drifting to the screens that showed the image of the vessel. The United States proposed sending a diplomatic mission, a probe, anything that might elicit a response. China suggested preparing for the worst, mobilizing military forces and evacuating coastal cities. Russia offered to deploy its nuclear arsenal, just in case. But every proposal was met with the same question. What could humanity possibly do against a vessel that size? How could they fight something they couldn't even understand? The vessel entered Earth's orbit without ceremony, without fanfare, and without any apparent effort. It simply settled into place, a silent giant hanging 20,000 kilometers above the planet's surface. It was so large that it affected the tides, causing minor coastal flooding in some areas and receding waters in others. The gravitational anomaly it created was slight but noticeable, a constant reminder that humanity was no longer alone. The world watched and waited, and the vessel gave them nothing. The silence was the worst part. If the aliens had made demands, humanity could have responded. If they had attacked, humanity could have fought back. If they had communicated, humanity could have begun a dialogue. But there was nothing, and that nothing was far more terrifying than any threat could have been. It suggested that humanity was beneath notice, that the aliens were so far beyond them that they didn't even bother to make their intentions known. It suggested that humanity was insignificant, a species of children staring up at the sky, waiting for a sign that would never come. In the weeks that followed, the world began to adapt to the new reality. The vessel became a permanent fixture in the sky, a dark star that hung over every city, every village, every person on the planet. People went about their lives, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. The scientists continued to study the vessel, but they learned nothing new. It was immune to every form of scanning, every attempt at communication, every probe sent in its direction. It was as if the vessel was a black hole, absorbing everything but giving nothing back. The leaders of humanity continued their meetings, but the initial panic had faded, replaced by a grim resignation. They had no response because there was no response to give. They were powerless, and they knew it. The military leaders argued for action, any action, just to show that humanity was not afraid. But the civilian leaders were more cautious, aware that any aggressive move could be catastrophic. The debate raged on, but it was academic. Humanity had no way to harm the vessel, no way to communicate with it, and no way to understand it. As the months passed, the vessel remained unchanged, and humanity's leaders grew increasingly frustrated. They had no intelligence, no leverage, and no strategy. They were trapped in a waiting game with an opponent who refused to play. The people of Earth began to lose hope, their fear turning into a weary acceptance. The vessel had become a fact of life, something to be acknowledged but not understood. And in that acceptance, something began to change. The leaders of humanity, having exhausted every diplomatic, military, and scientific option, began to realize that perhaps their lack of response was itself a response. Perhaps, by doing nothing, they were sending a message of their own. The vessel's presence had unified humanity in a way that no event in history ever had. The petty squabbles between nations, the ideological divisions, the economic rivalries, all of it seemed so insignificant in the face of a common unknown. For the first time in history, humanity had a shared purpose, a shared fear, and a shared hope. The leaders of the world, stripped of their usual power and influence, were forced to recognize that they were not masters of the planet, but simply stewards of a fragile species, one that was small and insignificant in the vastness of the universe. It was in this moment of humility that something remarkable happened. The vessel, which had been silent for so long, began to change. Its surface, which had been uniformly dark, began to show faint patterns, like ripples on a pond. The scientists monitoring it were baffled, their instruments detecting energy emissions that defied explanation. The vessel was doing something, and for the first time, humanity had something to respond to. The leaders of the world gathered once again, their eyes fixed on the screens, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The silent giant was finally speaking, and nobody knew what it would say. The patterns on the vessel's surface continued to shift and flow, forming complex geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an internal light. The scientists who had studied the vessel for months were baffled by the sudden activity, their instruments recording data that made no sense. The energy emissions were unlike anything they had ever seen, not electromagnetic, not gravitational, but something entirely new. It was as if the vessel was using a language that existed outside the known laws of physics, a communication method that operated on principles humanity had not yet discovered. The leaders of Earth were presented with the data, and they stared at it in confusion. They had expected a transmission, a voice, a video, something they could understand. Instead, they were given patterns that changed and evolved with every passing moment. The scientists theorized that these patterns might be the vessel's way of communicating, a visual language that encoded information in ways that were not immediately obvious. But decoding the patterns proved to be a monumental challenge. The shapes were too complex, too abstract, too alien to fit into any framework of understanding humanity possessed. Days turned into weeks, and the patterns continued to shift. The vessel was doing something, but what it was doing remained a mystery. The world's attention had shifted from fear to curiosity, and the global media was filled with experts offering their theories. Some believed the patterns were a greeting, a friendly gesture meant to show that the aliens were willing to communicate. Others believed it was a warning, a display of power meant to intimidate. And still others believed it was something else entirely, a message that was not meant for humanity at all, but for something else, something beyond the scope of human understanding. The leaders of Earth grew increasingly frustrated. They had no way to respond to something they couldn't understand, and their initial hope that the vessel's activity would provide answers had been dashed. Instead, it had only created more questions. The military leaders renewed their calls for action, arguing that the vessel's silence was a sign of hostility, that humanity needed to show strength in the face of the unknown. But the civilian leaders held firm, insisting that any aggressive move would be disastrous. The debate continued, but it was clear that humanity was still powerless, still waiting for a response that would never come. Amidst the chaos, a small team of scientists and linguists began to work on a radical theory. They believed that the patterns on the vessel's surface were not meant to be decoded, but to be experienced. The patterns, they argued, were not a language in the traditional sense, but a form of art, a way of conveying emotions and concepts that transcended words. The vessel's creators, they theorized, were not trying to communicate information, but rather to share a part of themselves, to express something that could not be captured in symbols or equations. The theory was met with skepticism, but the scientists persisted. They spent hours studying the patterns, trying to understand the emotions behind them. They found that the patterns had a rhythmic quality, a pulse that seemed to resonate with something deep within the human psyche. It was as if the patterns were speaking directly to the subconscious, bypassing the conscious mind entirely. The scientists began to report strange experiences, feelings of euphoria, moments of clarity, and profound insights that seemed to come from nowhere. They were convinced that the vessel was communicating something, and that humanity was beginning to understand. The leaders of Earth were skeptical, but they had no other leads to follow. They gave the scientists permission to share their findings with the world, and the response was immediate. People from all over the planet began to experience the same strange sensations when they looked at the vessel. The patterns had become a global phenomenon, something that united humanity in a shared experience. For the first time in history, billions of people were looking at the same thing, feeling the same thing, and it was changing them. The vessel's patterns continued to evolve, becoming more complex and more emotionally resonant. The scientists believed that the vessel was responding to humanity's response, that it was learning from the collective consciousness of the planet. The patterns were not static but dynamic, adapting to the emotions and thoughts of the billions of beings who watched it. It was as if the vessel was having a conversation with humanity, a conversation that was happening on a level that transcended language. The leaders of Earth began to realize that their inability to respond was not a weakness, but a strength. They had been trying to communicate with the vessel on their own terms, using methods that were familiar to them. But the vessel was operating on a different plane, a plane that humanity was only beginning to understand. The silence of the vessel had been a lesson, a way of forcing humanity to listen, to observe, and to learn. And humanity had done just that, slowly and painfully coming to the realization that there was more to the universe than they had ever imagined. As the weeks passed, the patterns on the vessel's surface began to coalesce into a single image, a vast and intricate mandala that seemed to contain the entire universe. It was a breathtaking sight, a work of art that was beyond anything humanity had ever created. The scientists were in awe, the leaders were humbled, and the people of Earth were filled with a sense of wonder that they had never experienced before. The vessel had given humanity a gift, a glimpse of something greater than itself, and it had changed everything. The leaders of Earth realized that their response to the vessel had been wrong from the beginning. They had tried to control the situation, to impose their own logic on something that operated on a different level. They had been too focused on the military and diplomatic responses, too caught up in their own fears and ambitions. But the vessel had shown them a different path, a path of humility, patience, and understanding. And in that realization, they found a new sense of purpose, a new way of looking at the world, and a new hope for the future. The vessel's final pattern remained in place for several days, a constant reminder of the profound experience humanity had shared. The world was quiet, the usual noise of politics and conflict replaced by a deep and contemplative silence. People were changed, their priorities shifted, their fears forgotten. The vessel had not communicated in words, but it had communicated in a way that was far more powerful. It had touched the soul of humanity, and it had shown them that they were not alone. The vessel continued to hang in Earth's orbit, its surface now displaying a vast and intricate mandala that seemed to pulse with an inner light. For weeks, the mandala remained unchanged, a silent and awe-inspiring symbol of the connection humanity had forged with the unknown. But then, without warning, the mandala began to shift. The patterns dissolved, flowing back into the dark surface of the vessel, and for the first time in months, the vessel was once again silent. The scientists were alarmed, their instruments detecting a massive energy buildup coming from the heart of the vessel. The leaders of Earth were summoned to an emergency meeting, their faces pale with fear. The energy emissions were unlike anything they had ever seen, a concentrated beam of pure energy that was aimed directly at the planet. The military leaders immediately called for an evacuation, but it was too late. The beam had already been fired, and it was traveling at the speed of light. There was no time to react, no time to do anything but wait and hope. The beam struck the Earth's atmosphere, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sky began to change. Colors that had never been seen before flooded the heavens, swirling and dancing like the aurora borealis on a cosmic scale. The phenomenon spread across the entire planet, a breathtaking display of light and color that was visible everywhere. People looked up from their cities and villages, their farms and their homes, and they were filled with a sense of wonder that they had never experienced before. The beam was not a weapon, but a gift, a final message from the vessel's creators. As the colors continued to swirl, the people of Earth began to experience something extraordinary. They felt a deep and profound sense of connection, a feeling that they were all part of something greater than themselves. The divisions that had separated them for so long, the hatred, the fear, the greed, all of it seemed to melt away. The beam was not just a display of light and color. It was a transmission of consciousness, a way of sharing the collective experience of an entire civilization. The leaders of Earth watched the display in stunned silence. They had expected a threat, a demand, a communication of some kind. Instead, they were given a gift that had changed their world in ways they could not fully comprehend. The beam had not harmed a single person, had not damaged a single structure, had not altered the planet in any physical way. But it had altered something far more important. It had altered humanity itself. In the days that followed, the world was transformed. The petty squabbles between nations seemed trivial, the economic disparities seemed insignificant, the ideological divisions seemed pointless. People began to work together in ways they had never done before, united by a shared experience that had touched their very souls. The leaders of Earth, once driven by ambition and power, now worked tirelessly to build a better world, a world that was worthy of the gift they had received. The scientists continued to study the vessel, but they found nothing new. The mandala had disappeared, and the vessel was once again a silent monolith. It seemed that the vessel had done what it had come to do, had delivered its message, and was now waiting for humanity to respond. But what response was it looking for? The leaders of Earth debated the question, but they had no answer. The vessel's final act had been so profound, so transformative, that they were still struggling to understand it. The people of Earth, however, had already begun to respond. They were rebuilding their societies, their economies, their relationships. They were learning to live in harmony, to value cooperation over competition, to prioritize the well-being of the planet over their own selfish desires. The vessel had not told them to do any of this. It had simply shown them a glimpse of what was possible. And in that glimpse, they had found the inspiration to change their world. The leaders of Earth realized that their response to the vessel was not a single action, but a continuous process. They had to be patient, to trust in the wisdom of the vessel's creators, and to continue to work toward a better future. They had been given a gift that was beyond measure, and they had to honor that gift by becoming the best versions of themselves. It was a daunting task, but they were ready to face it. They had been shown the path, and they were determined to walk it. The vessel remained in orbit, a silent reminder of the extraordinary event that had changed humanity forever. Its creators were still a mystery, but their message was clear. They had not come to conquer or to destroy, but to teach. They had shown humanity that there was more to the universe than they had ever imagined, and they had given them the tools to find their own way. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in history, humanity was looking forward to it with hope and determination. The transformation of Earth was not immediate, but it was relentless. The beam from the vessel had opened a door in the human mind, a door that had been closed for millennia. People who had once been driven by fear and greed now found themselves guided by empathy and compassion. The old systems of power and control began to crumble, replaced by new structures based on cooperation and mutual respect. The leaders of Earth, who had once been the architects of division, now became the architects of unity. The scientists were at the forefront of this transformation. They had been the first to understand the vessel's message, and they were now working to translate that message into practical action. They developed new technologies that harnessed the power of clean energy, new agricultural methods that could feed a growing population, and new medical treatments that could cure diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. The vessel had given them the inspiration, and they were determined to turn that inspiration into reality. The world was buzzing with activity. People from all walks of life were coming together to build a better future. The old boundaries of nation and tribe had faded, replaced by a sense of global citizenship. The people of Earth were no longer divided by race, religion, or nationality. They were united by a shared identity as members of the human family. It was a dream that had seemed impossible just a few months before, but now it was becoming a reality. The leaders of Earth watched the transformation with a sense of awe. They had been powerless to stop the vessel, and now they were powerless to guide the transformation. It was happening on its own, driven by the collective will of a people who had been awakened to their potential. The leaders realized that their role was no longer to command, but to serve. They were stewards of a new world, and their only job was to ensure that the transformation continued smoothly. The vessel remained in orbit, a constant reminder of the journey humanity had taken. Its surface was once again dark and silent, but its presence was felt in every corner of the planet. The scientists continued to monitor it, hoping for some sign of further communication. But the vessel gave them nothing, and they began to accept that it had done what it had come to do. The vessel's creators had given humanity a gift, and it was up to humanity to use it wisely. As the months passed, the transformation of Earth continued to deepen. The people of the planet were learning to live in harmony, not just with each other, but with the planet itself. They were cleaning up the oceans, restoring the forests, and protecting the wildlife. They were building cities that were sustainable, economies that were equitable, and societies that were just. The vessel had shown them what was possible, and they were determined to achieve it. The leaders of Earth held a global summit to celebrate the progress that had been made. The event was broadcast to every corner of the planet, and the people watched with a sense of pride and accomplishment. The leaders spoke of the journey they had taken, the challenges they had faced, and the hope they held for the future. They acknowledged that the vessel had been the catalyst for their transformation, and they expressed their gratitude to its unknown creators. But even as they celebrated, the leaders knew that the journey was far from over. The vessel's gift had been a beginning, not an end. There were still challenges to face, problems to solve, and lessons to learn. The people of Earth were not perfect, and there would be setbacks along the way. But they were united in their determination to build a better world, and that determination was stronger than any obstacle. The vessel had shown humanity the path, but it was up to humanity to walk it. The leaders were confident that they could do it, that they could rise to the challenge and create a future that was worthy of the gift they had received. The vessel had given them a glimpse of a greater reality, and they were determined to make that reality their own. The scientists continued to study the vessel, hoping to unlock its secrets. They were convinced that the vessel's creators were still out there, somewhere in the vastness of the universe. They wanted to find them, to communicate with them, to learn from them. But they knew that they had to be patient, that they had to earn the right to make contact. The vessel's creators had not come to Earth to be worshipped or feared. They had come to teach. And the lesson was still being learned. The world had been changed forever. The vessel had not destroyed humanity. It had saved it. It had shown them a new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of living. And in doing so, it had given them the greatest gift of all, the gift of a future. The people of Earth looked up at the vessel, and they saw not a threat, but a promise. A promise of a better world, a brighter future, and a destiny that was theirs to create. The vessel had been in orbit for 5 years, and Earth had transformed in ways that were unimaginable. The old divisions were gone, replaced by a sense of unity that spanned the globe. The people of Earth were no longer citizens of individual nations. They were citizens of a single planet, a single species, a single family. The vessel had taught them that their differences were superficial, that their common humanity was far more important than any label. The leaders of Earth had become a council of equals, working together to guide the planet through its transformation. They were no longer driven by ambition or power. They were driven by a sense of purpose. They had been given a gift, and they were determined to honor it. They had created a new system of governance that was based on cooperation, transparency, and accountability. The world was no longer ruled by fear and greed. It was ruled by hope and compassion. The scientists had made incredible strides in their understanding of the vessel. They had developed new technologies that could harness the power of the universe, new theories that could explain the mysteries of existence. They were no longer limited by the boundaries of human knowledge. They were exploring the infinite possibilities of the cosmos. The vessel had given them a glimpse of a greater reality, and they were determined to explore it. The people of Earth had found a new sense of purpose. They were no longer focused on their own individual desires. They were focused on the greater good. They were building a world that was sustainable, equitable, and just. They were working together to solve the problems that had plagued humanity for centuries. They were creating a future that was worthy of the gift they had received. The vessel remained in orbit, a silent witness to the transformation. Its surface was dark and still, but its presence was felt in every corner of the planet. The people of Earth looked up at it with gratitude, their hearts filled with a sense of wonder. They had been given a gift that was beyond measure, and they were determined to use it wisely. As the years passed, the transformation of Earth continued to deepen. The people of the planet were learning to live in harmony with each other and with the planet itself. They had created a world that was peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable. They had overcome the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. They had built a future that was brighter than anyone had ever imagined. The leaders of Earth held a global summit to mark the 5th anniversary of the vessel's arrival. The event was broadcast to every corner of the planet, and the people watched with a sense of pride and accomplishment. The leaders spoke of the journey they had taken, the challenges they had faced, and the hope they held for the future. They acknowledged that the vessel had been the catalyst for their transformation, and they expressed their gratitude to its unknown creators. But even as they celebrated, the leaders knew that the journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, problems to solve, and lessons to learn. The vessel's gift had been a beginning, not an end. The people of Earth were determined to continue their journey, to explore the vastness of the universe, to learn from the unknown. The scientists continued to study the vessel, but they had made little progress. The vessel was still a mystery, its secrets locked away in its dark and silent surface. But the scientists were not discouraged. They knew that they had to be patient, that they had to earn the right to understand the vessel's creators. They were determined to continue their work, to explore the mysteries of the universe, to find their place in the cosmos. The vessel's creators were still out there, somewhere in the vastness of the universe. The people of Earth knew that they would one day make contact, that they would one day learn the secrets of the vessel. They were patient, they were determined, and they were ready. They had been given a gift, and they were determined to honor it. The world had been changed forever. The vessel had not destroyed humanity, it had saved it. It had shown them a new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of living. And in doing so, it had given them the greatest gift of all, the gift of a future. The people of Earth looked up at the vessel, and they saw not a threat, but a promise. A promise of a better world, a brighter future, and a destiny that was theirs to create. The vessel remained in orbit, a silent guardian of humanity's transformation. Its surface was dark and still, but its presence was a constant reminder of the journey humanity had taken. The people of Earth had been given a gift, and they had used it wisely. They had built a world that was worthy of the vessel's creators, a world that was filled with hope, compassion, and unity. And as they looked up at the vessel, they knew that their journey was just beginning. The universe was vast and full of mysteries, and they were ready to explore it.